"If you don't sign this commission waiver, you're done," Bradley threatened, pointing at the door. I refused. By that afternoon, my termination notice was printed. But Bradley forgot one tiny detail. My private holding company owned the land directly beneath the plaza's main electrical substation. To understand how a 25-year career ended in a 30-second shouting match, you have to go back to 2001. I was 27 years old back then, a licensed commercial real estate broker with a cheap car, a massive pile of student debt, and a hunger to make a mark in the city. That was the year I met Lawrence Vance. Lawrence was a self-made developer who had just mortgaged his house, his cars, and probably his soul to buy a semi-abandoned industrial rail yard on the edge of the city's expanding commercial district. He had a vision to turn it into Vance Commercial Plaza, a 450,000 square foot retail and office complex. He had the land, he had the architectural blueprints, and he had a construction loan, but he was completely out of cash. During the initial phase of development, we hit a massive roadblock. The local railway company, Pac Coast Rail, owned a narrow, 300-foot strip of land designated as Parcel 4B. This strip lay directly between the main state highway and the entrance of our proposed development. More importantly, it was the exact corridor where the city required us to run the main water mains, sewer lines, and primary electrical conduits for the entire plaza. Pac Coast Rail knew we were in a corner, and they demanded $150,000 in cash. For the title, Lawrence did not have it. The bank refused to extend his construction loan, and the utility companies refused to begin work until we could show clean title or a permanent easement over Parcel 4B. Lawrence was desperate. He called me into his temporary trailer office on the dusty construction site. I remember the smell of cheap coffee and stale blueprint ink. He sat me down and laid out the problem. I had just received an inheritance of $150,000 from my grandfather's estate, which was sitting in a low-interest savings account. Lawrence knew about this because I had mentioned it during a lunch meeting a week prior. He made me a deal that sounded crazy at the time, but was legally airtight. He proposed that my private holding company, Higgins Holdings LLC, buy Parcel 4B directly from Pac Coast Rail. In exchange, Higgins Holdings LLC would lease the parcel back to Vance Commercial Plaza under a 99-year ground lease for a nominal rent of $1 per year. The catch was in the lease's default provisions. Lawrence was so grateful for the lifeline that he instructed his corporate counsel to draft a special non-standard clause. Under Section 14 of the ground lease, the agreement remained valid only as long as I, Walter Higgins, remained employed by Vance Commercial Plaza as the senior leasing director, or until I retired at age 65. If the company terminated my employment without cause, or if they failed to pay my contractually mandated commissions within 30 days of a lease execution, the ground lease on Parcel 4B would automatically terminate with 10 days written notice. Upon termination, all easements, utility licenses, and road access rights granted under the lease would immediately expire, and Higgins Holdings LLC would have the right to retake possession of the land, including the right to erect barriers and disconnect any unauthorized utility lines. I bought the land. The utilities were laid, the plaza was built, and for 25 years, I poured my life into Vance Commercial Plaza. I knew every tenant, every landlord representative, and every square foot of the property. I brought in national retailers, regional banks, and high-end restaurants. The crown jewel of my work was Vanguard Retail Corp., our anchor tenant. They occupied 120,000 square feet of prime retail space, drawing thousands of shoppers daily and anchoring the financial stability of the entire plaza. By 2026, the plaza's value had skyrocketed to $85 million, generating millions in annual rental income. My employment contract with Lawrence was simple. I received a modest base salary, but my real compensation came from a 15% commission on the total value of all new leases and renewals I personally negotiated. It was a lucrative deal, but Lawrence gladly paid it because my relationships kept the property at a 98% occupancy rate. For over 2 decades, our partnership was flawless. Lawrence was a man of his word, and he always respected the legal reality of what we had built. But things changed in 2022. Lawrence's health began to deteriorate rapidly, forcing him to step back from day-to-day operations. His son, Bradley Vance, returned from an expensive East Coast business school with a Master of Business Administration degree and an insufferable attitude. Bradley was 34 years old, wore tailored Italian suits, and believed that real estate was purely a game of cutting costs and squeezing vendors. He had never negotiated a commercial lease in his life, yet he was appointed Chief Operating Officer. He viewed the long-term staff, including me, as expensive relics of a bygone era. Bradley immediately began targeting the company's expenses. He replaced our local high-quality maintenance crew with a cheap, third-party service that let the landscaping die and left potholes unrepaired. He cut tenant improvement allowances, causing several high-end boutique tenants to look elsewhere when their leases expired. But his biggest target was my commission structure. He couldn't comprehend why a senior leasing director should earn a 15% commission on major renewals when in his mind the tenants would renew anyway because of the location. I watched Bradley's management style with growing concern, but I kept my head down and focused on the biggest deal of my career, the 10-year renewal of our anchor tenant, Vanguard Retail Corp. Their lease was set to expire at the end of the year, and they were actively looking at a newly built shopping center 2 miles down the highway. For 18 months, I worked late nights, analyzing demographic data, structuring rent escalations, and meeting with Vanguard's corporate board. I convinced them to stay by structuring a $12 million 10-year lease renewal. The renewal was a massive victory for the company. It stabilized the plaza's valuation at $85 million and cleared the way for a confidential project Bradley had been working on: the sale of Vance Commercial Plaza to a massive real estate investment trust called Summit Peak REIT. The REIT's acquisition was conditioned entirely on Vanguard Retail Corp signing the renewal, as they refused to purchase a commercial plaza without an active, long-term anchor tenant. The lease was finalized on a Thursday afternoon. I had the signed documents in my leather briefcase, representing $12 million in guaranteed revenue for the firm. By the terms of my employment contract, my 15% commission amounted to exactly $1,800,000, payable within 30 days of lease execution. I walked into the corporate office on Friday morning, ready to present the signed lease to Lawrence and Bradley. But Lawrence wasn't there. Instead, Bradley sat behind the massive mahogany desk, flanked by the company's chief financial officer, Sarah Jenkins, and a young, eager corporate attorney I had never seen before. The air in the room was cold, and I immediately felt that something was wrong. I placed the thick, blue-bound folder containing the signed Vanguard lease on the polished mahogany table. Bradley picked it up, flipping through the signature pages with a greedy smile. He checked the seal of Vanguard Retail Corp and the signature of their CEO, confirming the 10-year, $12 million commitment. The tension in his shoulders seemed to vanish for a brief second, replaced by an insufferable air of triumph. He looked up at me, his eyes cold and transactional. He slid the lease folder over to Sarah Jenkins, the chief financial officer, who immediately began scanning the documents into her laptop. Then Bradley reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the table toward me. It was titled Commission Waiver and Contract Amendment. I looked down at the document, then back at Bradley. I asked him what this was. Bradley leaned back, crossing his arms with a smug grin. He explained that due to corporate restructuring and the pending acquisition by Summit Peak REIT, the firm was consolidating its compensation structures. He said that a 15% commission on a $12 million renewal was outdated, excessive, and completely out of line with modern corporate standards. He told me they were capping all leasing commissions at a flat fee of $50,000 per transaction, effective immediately. He wanted me to sign the waiver, relinquishing my claim to the $1,800,000 I had contractually earned. I felt a cold wave of anger, but I kept my voice flat and professional. I reminded him that I had spent 18 months working on this deal, flying back and forth to Vanguard's headquarters and restructuring the entire lease package to keep them from leaving. I told him my contract with Lawrence Vance was legally binding, and that the 15% commission was the sole reason the plaza was still occupied and valued at $85 million. Without Vanguard, the REIT sale would collapse. Bradley laughed, a short, dismissive sound that echoed in the quiet boardroom. He said my contract was signed by his father, who was no longer running the firm, and that times had changed. He told me that $50,000 was more than generous for what he called administrative paperwork. He threatened that if I did not sign the waiver right there, the company would terminate my employment for cause, citing insubordination and refusal to comply with company policies, and I would get nothing at all. Sarah Jenkins didn't even look up from her screen as she chimed in, saying the company's legal counsel had already reviewed the matter. She claimed that because the lease was negotiated using the Vance Commercial brand and office resources, my role was deemed administrative, and the company was prepared to fight any lawsuit I might file. She sneered that they had a team of corporate lawyers on retainer and could drag the case out in federal court for the next 10 years, by which time I would be broke and bankrupt. I looked at the young attorney sitting next to Bradley. He was looking at his shoes, refusing to make eye contact. It was clear this trap had been planned for weeks, timed perfectly for the moment I delivered the signed Vanguard lease. Bradley wanted the REIT acquisition to go through so he could cash out his shares and walk away with a fortune, and he didn't want my $1,800,000 commission cutting into his payout. I looked Bradley straight in the eye and told him I would not sign the waiver. I told him my contract was clear, and I expected the full commission to be wired to my account within 30 days as specified by the contract. Bradley's face turned red, his smug composure shattering in an instant. He slammed his hand on the mahogany table, standing up and towering over me. That was when he screamed the words that ended my 25-year career. "Get the hell out of my building, Walter. You're fired, and you won't get a single penny of your $12 million lease renewal commission." I didn't flinch, I didn't shout, and I didn't argue. I simply stood up, slowly buttoned my navy suit jacket, and picked up my empty leather briefcase. I looked at Bradley and said, "Understood." I walked out of the boardroom and down the long carpeted hallway to my office. The corporate staff was quiet, having heard Bradley shouting through the thin walls. I grabbed a cardboard box from the supply room and began packing my personal belongings. I packed the framed photo of my late father, my desk clock, my mechanical keyboard, and a few personal notebooks. I left all the company-owned files, the lease templates, and the tenant databases on the desk. I didn't need them. As I walked out of the building, the security guard, a man named Roger, whom I had known for 15 years, looked at me with sad eyes. He asked if everything was all right. I smiled, patted his shoulder, and told him to take care of himself. I walked out into the bright afternoon sun, loaded the cardboard box into the trunk of my sedan, and drove home. When I arrived at my suburban home, the house was quiet. I went straight to my home office, sat down at my desk, and unlocked my fireproof filing cabinet. I pulled out a faded manila folder labeled Higgins Holdings LLC, Vance Ground Lease 2001. Inside was the original fully executed 99-year ground lease for Parcel 4B, signed by Lawrence Vance and me, complete with the county recorder's official seal. I read through Section 14 once again, the words clear and unambiguous. The lease was contingent upon my continued employment. A termination without cause or a failure to pay earned commissions constituted an automatic breach. The lease would terminate 10 days after written notice was served, revoking all easements, access rights, and utility licenses. I picked up the phone and called Oliver Finch, a senior real estate litigation attorney who had been a close friend of my family for 30 years. I explained the situation, telling him about the Vanguard lease, the firing, and Bradley's refusal to pay my commission. Oliver listened quietly, then let out a low whistle. He asked me if I still held the original deed to Parcel 4B. I told him I did. He chuckled and told me that Bradley had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He explained that because the lease was tied to my employment, the termination without cause was a trigger event. He said we would draft the formal notice of lease termination and land reclamation immediately, giving Vance Commercial Plaza exactly 10 days to vacate my land and cease all utility transmissions. I asked Oliver about the REIT sale. Oliver laughed and said that without Parcel 4B, Vance Commercial Plaza had no legal access to the highway, no water lines, and no sewer connection. The REIT's due diligence team would flag the easement issue immediately, and the entire $85 million deal would fall apart. I told Oliver to proceed. The trap was set, and Bradley had walked right into it. On Monday morning, Oliver Finch and I finalized the legal paperwork. The primary document was a formal notice of lease termination and demand to vacate, addressed directly to Vance Commercial Plaza LLC and its managing members. The notice was detailed, citing the original 2001 ground lease, the specific clauses of Section 14, and the date of my termination without cause. It stated that due to the unilateral termination of my employment and the explicit refusal to pay my earned commission of $1,800,000, the lease for Parcel 4B was officially terminated. The plaza was given exactly 10 calendar days, ending on Monday, August 3, 2026, at 9 a.m. to remove all private property, seal all utility lines running through the parcel, and cease using the access road. We hired a professional process server to deliver the notice directly to Bradley Vance at the corporate office. I also sent copy-certified versions of the notice along with the original 2001 ground lease and my property deed to the city's building department, the local water and sewer authority, and the regional electrical utility provider. When the process server handed the papers to Bradley on Tuesday afternoon, his response was exactly what Oliver and I had anticipated. According to the process server's affidavit, Bradley laughed, crumpled the first page of the cover letter, and tossed it into his wastebasket, telling the server that Walter Higgins was a disgruntled former employee who was grasping at straws. Bradley told his administrative assistant that he didn't have time for empty threats and instructed her not to forward any more communications from my attorney. He was completely focused on the due diligence phase of the $85 million sale to Summit Peak REIT, which was scheduled to close in less than 3 weeks. But while Bradley ignored the warning, the city utilities did not. The legal department of the Municipal Water and Sewer Authority immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. Under municipal code, The city could not operate or maintain public utility lines crossing private land without a valid recorded easement. Because the easement was granted solely under the terms of the ground lease, the termination of that lease meant the city was legally trespassing on my private property. The city's legal counsel contacted Oliver Finch, confirming that if Vance Commercial Plaza did not secure an alternative easement or resolve the dispute by the August 3rd deadline, the city would be legally forced to shut off the main water valve located on my parcel to avoid liability. Similarly, the electrical utility provider, Northern Power, reviewed the deeds and realized that the primary conduits feeding the plaza's main substation ran directly beneath the gravel shoulder of my access road. They sent an official inquiry to Vance Commercial Plaza, demanding proof of a valid easement, warning that failure to provide it would result in a termination of service to the substation to prevent property damage claims. During those 10 days, I did not sit idle. I hired Apex Security Fencing, a commercial contractor, to prepare for the physical reclamation of the land. I paid them a $5,000 deposit to mobilize a crew and deliver 20 concrete jersey barriers, each weighing 4,000 pounds, to the edge of the property line on the morning of August 3rd. I also hired 2 off-duty police officers to be present at the site to maintain the peace and enforce my private property rights, presenting them with the land survey and the official notice of land reclamation. I visited the county recorder's office to file a formal lis pendens against the entire Vance Commercial Plaza property. A lis pendens is a public notice of a pending lawsuit involving real estate. This meant that any potential buyer, including the due diligence team at Summit Peak REIT, would immediately see that the property's access and utilities were under active legal dispute. No title insurance company would write a policy for an $85 million acquisition with an active lis pendens on the title. By Friday, July 31st, the tension was building, but the corporate office remained completely silent. Bradley had not reached out, nor had Sarah Jenkins. They truly believed I was bluffing. They assumed that an individual leasing director would never have the resources or the courage to block a major commercial plaza. They had no idea that my holding company was completely debt-free, and that my grandfather's inheritance had been carefully managed and invested over the years, giving me a solid financial cushion to fight a long legal battle. On Sunday night, August 2nd, I drove by the plaza. The lights were bright, the parking lot was filled with cars, and the Vanguard retail store was bustling with shoppers. I looked at the 300-foot strip of land that was Parcel 4B, the narrow road that served as the sole entry and exit point for thousands of vehicles every day. Beneath that asphalt lay the water, sewer, and electrical lines that kept the entire $85 million development alive. For 25 years, I had maintained this corridor, ensuring the success of the plaza. I checked my watch. In less than 12 hours, the 10-day notice would expire. I felt no hesitation, no regret, and no fear. Bradley had chosen to break his father's word, to steal my commission, and to humiliate me. He believed his wealth and corporate power made him untouchable. But he had forgotten the fundamental rule of real estate. You cannot build an empire on land you do not own. I went home, set my alarm for 6 a.m. and slept peacefully. At exactly 8:30 a.m. on Monday, August 3rd, I stood at the edge of the public highway, wearing my dark navy blue suit and holding a thermos of coffee. The morning air was cool, but the sun was climbing fast. Next to me were 2 off-duty police officers in full uniform, hired to ensure the peace was kept. Minutes later, the flatbed trucks from Apex Security Fencing rumbled onto the gravel shoulder of the highway. Behind them was a heavy crane truck carrying the concrete jersey barriers. At 9 a.m., the 10-day notice expired. I gave the foreman the signal. The crane began lifting the 4,000-pound concrete blocks, placing them side by side across the entrance of Vance Commercial Plaza. The workers quickly bolted them together, creating an impenetrable wall. They then rolled out 6-foot-tall chain-link fencing panels, locking them into place behind the concrete. On the fence, they hung large, high-visibility aluminum signs that read, "Private property, no trespassing, access easement revoked. All vehicles will be towed at Roger's expense." Just as the last fence panel was secured, 3 utility trucks from the city water department and 2 service vans from Northern Power arrived. The utility supervisors met with me and the off-duty officers. I handed them my certified property deed and the official record of the lease termination. The water utility foreman nodded, walked over to the main valve cover located on my strip of land, and used a long metal key to shut off the main water supply to the entire plaza. Simultaneously, the Northern Power technicians opened the utility cabinet at the property boundary, disconnected the primary electrical lines, and locked the switchgear. Within minutes, the entire 450,000 square foot plaza went completely dark. The air conditioning systems shut down, their low hum dying out. The traffic lights at the plaza's internal intersections went black. Inside the retail stores and offices, emergency lights kicked on, casting a dim, eerie glow. Without water pressure, the toilets in the public restrooms and office suites stopped functioning. A line of cars began to form on the highway, drivers honking their horns in confusion as they realized the main entrance was blocked. The manager of the Vanguard Retail Corp store, a woman named Linda whom I had worked with for years, walked down to the fence line. She looked at the concrete barriers, then at me. I walked over and explained the situation calmly. I told her that the ground lease holding the plaza's utilities and access road had been terminated due to a material breach by Vance Commercial Plaza. I gave her a copy of the legal notice and suggested she contact Bradley Vance immediately. She looked horrified and immediately pulled out her cell phone. At 9:45 a.m., a black Porsche came speeding down the highway, swerving onto the shoulder and screeching to a halt just inches from the concrete barriers. Bradley Vance climbed out of the car. His tie was loose, his jacket was open, and his face was a deep shade of crimson. He ran up to the fence, shaking the chain-link panels and screaming at the top of his lungs. He demanded that I tear down the barriers immediately, calling me a thief and a lunatic. He screamed that I was blockading a major commercial property and that he would have me thrown in prison by the end of the day. The two off-duty police officers stepped forward, placing their hands on their utility belts and ordering Bradley to step back from the fence. Bradley yelled at the officers, demanding that they arrest me for blocking the road. The senior officer, a veteran named Sergeant Miller, calmly pulled out a clipboard. He showed Bradley a copy of my recorded deed, the land survey, and the termination notice. Miller told Bradley that the land he was standing next to was private property owned by Higgins Holdings LLC, and that the lease allowing the plaza to use it had expired. He warned Bradley that if he attempted to remove the barriers or trespass onto the parcel, he would be arrested on the spot. Bradley's phone began ringing. He answered it, and even from 10 feet away I could hear the panicked voice of Sarah Jenkins. She was calling from the corporate office, which was now pitch black and hot. She told him that the due diligence team from Summit Peak REIT had just arrived for their final walkthrough. They were standing in the dark lobby, unable to access the building, watching the water trucks and the police officers at the entrance. The REIT's lead acquisition manager had just sent an email warning that they were pulling out of the $85 million deal due to an undisclosed title defect and active litigation. Furthermore, they were preparing to sue Vance Commercial Plaza for the 10% liquidated damages penalty, which amounted to $8,500,000. Before Bradley could respond to Sarah, another call came through. It was Vanguard's corporate legal department. They informed him that since the anchor store was without power and running water, Vance Commercial Plaza was in direct violation of the covenant of quiet enjoyment under their lease. They gave him exactly 24 hours to restore utilities and road access, or they would terminate their $12 million lease and sue for millions in lost revenue and relocation expenses. Bradley looked through the wire mesh of the fence, his eyes darting from me to the concrete barriers, and then to the dark, silent buildings behind him. The arrogance that had defined him for years was gone, replaced by a look of sheer panic. He looked at me, his voice trembling slightly. He asked what I wanted, suggesting they could pay me a $50,000 bonus to resolve the misunderstanding. I took a slow sip of my coffee, looked at my watch, and smiled. I told Bradley that I had warned him, but he had thrown my notice in the trash. I told him that I was no longer an employee of Vance Commercial Plaza and that all further communications would have to go through my attorney, Oliver Finch. I turned my back on him and walked back to my car, leaving Bradley standing in the heat, surrounded by the silence of his dark, paralyzed empire. By Tuesday morning, the financial hemorrhaging at Vance Commercial Plaza had reached a critical state. The property had been completely dark and without water for 24 hours. Several office tenants had already sent formal notices of rent abatement, and Vanguard's corporate office had issued a final warning. If the utilities were not restored by 5 p.m., they would officially terminate their lease, dismantle their inventory, and file a $10 million lawsuit for breach of contract. Lawrence Vance, hearing of the disaster from his hospital bed, was reportedly furious. According to my contacts in the firm, Lawrence had called Bradley from his room, his voice shaking with anger, demanding to know how his son had managed to paralyze an $85 million asset in a single morning. Lawrence ordered Bradley to resolve the issue immediately, regardless of the cost, before the REIT sale collapsed and forced the company into foreclosure. At 10 a.m., Oliver Finch received an urgent call from Vance Commercial Plaza's lead corporate counsel. They requested an emergency settlement meeting. Oliver agreed, but only on the condition that Bradley Vance and Sarah Jenkins attend in person, and that they present a certified bank draft of my outstanding commission as a gesture of good faith. The meeting took place at 1 p.m. in the conference room of Oliver's downtown office. Bradley walked in looking like a shadow of his former self. His Italian suit was wrinkled, his hair was uncombed, and the smug arrogance that had defined him was completely gone. Sarah Jenkins sat next to him, her face pale, carrying a thick binder of financial reports. Oliver Finch opened the meeting by laying out our terms. I sat quietly next to him, letting my attorney handle the speaking. Oliver explained that the original terms were no longer on the table. The price of restoring the easements and access road had increased significantly due to the company's breach of contract and the legal expenses I had incurred. First, Oliver demanded the immediate payment of the original $1,800,000 leasing commission for the Vanguard renewal paid in full. Second, he demanded a double multiplier severance package under Clause 8B of my original employment contract. The contract specified that a termination without cause entitled me to 12 months of salary at $15,000 per month, multiplied by 2 in the event of bad faith termination. This amounted to exactly $360,000. Third, the ground lease for Parcel 4B would not be reinstated under the old terms. Instead, Higgins Holdings LLC would grant a new 20-year non-exclusive utility and access easement, but at a commercial market rate of $150,000 per year, triple net, with a 5% annual escalation. This meant the company, or any future owner of the plaza, would be legally obligated to pay my holding company a substantial annual rent just to keep the plaza open and connected to the grid. Fourth, the settlement agreement must include a fully executed release of liability, signed by Bradley and Lawrence Vance, admitting that the termination was without cause and that all commissions were contractually earned. Finally, Oliver stated that as a condition of granting the easement, Bradley Vance must be immediately removed from his position as Chief Operating Officer of Vance Commercial Plaza, with a professional third-party asset management firm hired to oversee the pending sale to Summit Peak REIT. Bradley jumped out of his chair, his face turning red again. He shouted that the terms were highway robbery, claiming that paying me over $2 million in cash and adding a $150,000 annual ground rent would ruin the profitability of the REIT sale. He looked at Sarah Jenkins, pleading for her support. But Sarah didn't look at him. She opened her binder and slid a spreadsheet across the table. She told Bradley that if they did not sign the agreement by 5 p.m., Vanguard would walk away, causing the $85 million sale to Summit Peak REIT to collapse. If the sale collapsed, the company would default on its $40 million construction refinancing mortgage, leading to immediate bank foreclosure and bankruptcy. She told him that paying the $2,160,000 was their only option to survive. She added that Lawrence Vance and the board of directors had already signed the authorization documents, bypassing Bradley's authority. Bradley slowly sank back into his chair. He looked at the settlement papers, then at me. I looked back at him, calm and silent. He realized he had no cards left to play. He had tried to steal my commission, and in doing so, he had compromised his family's entire real estate empire. With a shaking hand, Bradley picked up the pen and signed the settlement agreement. Sarah Jenkins signed next, followed by the corporate counsel. Oliver and I signed our copies, and the young attorney immediately initiated the wire transfers. 20 minutes later, Oliver's computer chimed. He checked the screen and smiled, showing me the confirmation. A total of $2,160,000 had been successfully deposited into Higgins Holdings LLC's bank account, along with the first year's ground rent of $150,000. I stood up, shook hands with the corporate counsel and Sarah Jenkins, and walked out of the room, ignoring Bradley entirely. By 3 p.m., the fencing crew from Apex Security Fencing had removed the concrete barriers and chain-link panels. The city water department turned the main valve back on, and Northern Power restored the electricity. The plaza came back to life, the air conditioners hummed, and shoppers streamed back into the stores. The sale of Vance Commercial Plaza to Summit Peak REIT closed 2 weeks later for $85 million. But the REIT's final purchase price was adjusted downward to account for the new 20-year ground rent of $150,000 paid to my holding company. Bradley Vance was officially terminated from the firm the following week, replaced by a professional management company. His reputation in the city's commercial real estate market was completely ruined, and no developer would hire him. I retired from active brokerage. Today, I spend my time managing my investments and enjoying the quiet of my home. Every year, Higgins Holdings LLC receives a wire transfer of $150,000, increasing by 5% annually, paid by the new owners of the plaza. Sometimes I drive by Vance Commercial Plaza just to look at that narrow 300-foot strip of land. It is a quiet reminder that in the corporate world you can try to steal someone's hard work, but you can never escape the legal reality of the ground beneath your feet.